The Forgotten Altar. My name is Robert, and I've always been passionate about photography. I'm not a professional, but I love hiking and finding unique spots to capture nature in its rawest form. Living in Oregon, I often explore the dense forests and hidden trails of the Pacific Northwest. It was during one of these trips that I stumbled upon something that I should have left alone, a discovery that would haunt me forever. It was a clear Saturday morning when I set off with my camera and backpack. I planned to explore a less-traveled hiking trail I'd read about online. The trail was surrounded by towering pines, their branches forming a natural canopy that filtered the sunlight into delicate beams. It was peaceful, and for the first hour, I didn't see another soul. As I ventured deeper into the woods, the trail became narrower, almost like it was fading into the forest. Curious, I decided to follow it, figuring it would lead to an interesting clearing or maybe a waterfall. What I found instead was an altar. The structure was old, made of moss-covered stone and partially buried in the ground. It stood about waist-high and was engraved with symbols I didn't recognize. Around it were scattered remnants of candles, small animal bones, and bits of cloth. The air felt different here, thicker, colder. I knelt down to get a closer look and began taking pictures. The altar was fascinating, like a relic from a forgotten time. As I photographed it, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. But when I looked around, there was nothing, just the trees and the rustling of leaves in the wind. When I got home that evening, I uploaded the pictures to my computer. At first glance, they seemed fine, sharp and detailed. But as I went through them, something caught my eye. In one of the photos, there was a shadow behind the altar. It wasn't mine. I'd been kneeling when I took the shot, and the shadow was tall and humanoid. I scrolled to the next picture, and the shadow was closer. It had moved, though I hadn't noticed anything while I was there. My stomach tightened as I continued looking. In the final photo, the shadow was no longer behind the altar. It was directly in front of it, as if staring into the camera. I convinced myself it was a trick of the light, an optical illusion caused by the angle of the sun. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The days that followed were unsettling. At night, I started hearing faint whispers, like someone speaking just out of earshot. Sometimes I'd wake up to find my bedroom colder than usual, despite the windows being closed. My cat, Max, refused to enter the room where I kept my camera and laptop. He'd hiss and arch his back if I tried to bring him near. Determined to understand what was happening, I revisited the photos. That's when I noticed something new. In one of the pictures, I saw not just the shadow, but faint outlines of faces, distorted, anguished faces within the engravings on the altar. It was as if they were screaming silently, trapped in the stone. Unable to shake the feeling that I'd disturbed something, I decided to return to the trail. Maybe seeing the altar again in daylight would put my mind at ease. I packed my camera, a flashlight, and a small notebook and headed back. When I reached the spot, the atmosphere was even heavier than before. The altar seemed different, darker somehow. As I approached, I noticed fresh offerings around it, more bones, newer candles, and a faint red stain that hadn't been there before. Suddenly, the forest around me went silent. No wind, no birds, nothing. Then I heard it, the whispering. It was louder now, clearer, like multiple voices murmuring in a language I couldn't understand. My chest tightened, and my hands began to shake. I raised my camera, hoping to capture whatever was happening. Through the lens, I saw them, shadows, dozens of them, emerging from the trees and converging around the altar. They moved unnaturally, flickering like flames. My breath caught in my throat as one of them turned its head toward me. Its face, or lack thereof, was a void, a blank space where features should have been. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my camera, and turned to run. The forest seemed different, the trail I'd come down now unfamiliar. As I ran, I could hear the whispers following me, growing louder, almost like a chant. I finally burst out onto a wider path and sprinted back to my car. My hands were trembling so much that it took me 3 tries to get the key into the ignition. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a brief moment, I saw a shadow standing at the edge of the trees, watching me leave. Since that day, nothing has been the same. At night, I still hear the whispers, no matter where I am. The photos I took won't delete from my computer, and sometimes I swear the shadows in them move when I'm not looking. I've tried to warn others about that trail, but it seems to pull people in, just like it did to me. If you ever find yourself in the Pacific Northwest and stumble upon an overgrown path leading to something ancient, do yourself a favor, turn around. Some things are meant to stay forgotten.
The Cursed Trail. I'm Mark, and I work as a wilderness guide in the Smoky Mountains of Tennessee. I've led countless tours through the region, helping people explore its breathtaking trails, waterfalls, and secluded spots. But one particular trip taught me a lesson I'll never forget. Some places are meant to stay hidden. It started like any other group tour. 4 hikers had signed up for an intermediate trail that promised scenic views and a peaceful trek through the forest. They were friendly, enthusiastic, and eager for an adventure. What none of us realized was that this adventure would turn into a nightmare. The trail we were on was well maintained and straightforward, but about halfway through, one of the hikers, Kevin, pointed out a faint side path that branched off into the woods. "Hey, this looks cool. Can we check it out?" he asked. I hesitated. The path wasn't marked on my map, and it didn't look like a standard trail. "It's probably just an old animal path," I replied. But Kevin and the others were intrigued. "Come on, Mark, it'll be fun. Maybe it leads to something interesting," he insisted. Against my better judgment, I agreed. I figured we'd explore for a few minutes and then head back. As we ventured deeper, the trail became narrower, the trees denser, and the air colder. It wasn't long before we came across something strange, a clearing. In the center of the clearing was a ring of stones. At first it looked like a long abandoned fire pit, but as we got closer, I noticed something unsettling. Inside the ring were bones, not just small animal bones, but large ones, some of which didn't look like they belonged to any animal I recognized. They were arranged in patterns, almost like symbols. "Wow, this is wild," Kevin said, bending down to examine them. I told him not to touch anything, but he ignored me. As he poked at one of the bones with a stick, a faint sound reached my ears. Drums, faint, distant, and rhythmic. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly. The group nodded, their expressions turning serious. "It's probably just wind or something," one of them suggested, but I could tell they didn't believe it either. We decided to head back to the main trail, but as we turned, we realized the path we had come from was gone. It was as if the forest had shifted, closing in on us. Panic began to set in, and the sound of the drums grew louder. The hikers were starting to argue, blaming me for taking them off the main trail. That's when we saw them. Between the trees, shadows began to flicker. They were tall, human-like, but their movements were wrong, jittery, almost like they were being pulled by invisible strings. "What the hell is that?" whispered Maria, one of the hikers. I didn't answer. I grabbed the group and told them to move, fast. But the forest seemed to work against us. Every path we took led us back to the clearing, where the stones and bones seemed to be waiting. When we returned to the clearing for the 3rd time, the drums stopped. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of our heavy breathing. Then, the shadows emerged fully from the trees, forming a circle around us. Kevin, who had been so eager to explore, suddenly dropped to his knees. His eyes were wide, unblinking, as if he were in a trance. He began muttering something under his breath, words none of us could understand. Before we could react, the shadows closed in on him. Their shapes blurred as they enveloped him completely, and in an instant, he was gone. No scream, no sound, just gone. The rest of us ran. It didn't matter where, we just needed to get away. The forest seemed alive, its branches reaching out like fingers, snagging our clothes and slowing us down. The shadows followed, their movements impossibly fast, darting between the trees like predators toying with their prey. Finally, we burst out onto the main trail. The sun was setting, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward us. We didn't stop running until we reached the parking lot. None of us spoke. The fear on their faces mirrored my own. When I reported what had happened, the authorities didn't believe me. They searched the area but found no trace of Kevin or the clearing. It was as if the forest had swallowed him whole. I quit guiding after that. The Smoky Mountains, once my haven, now feel like a trap. At night, I still hear the drums, faint but persistent, like they're calling me back. If you ever find yourself on an unfamiliar trail and come across an unmarked path, don't take it. Some places aren't meant to be discovered.
The Forest Keeper. My name is Emily, and I'm a biology student from Portland. I've always loved nature, especially forests. That's why I jumped at the chance to study wildlife in one of the most remote parts of Maine. It was supposed to be a routine research trip, a chance to collect data and immerse myself in the beauty of the wilderness. But what I found out there wasn't beauty. It was terror. The forest was dense, with towering pines and moss-covered rocks. My team had split up to cover more ground, and I was alone in my section, recording observations and collecting samples. As I walked deeper into the woods, I noticed how eerily quiet it was. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. Then I saw it. Nestled between two massive trees was a shrine. It was small but intricately built, with carvings of strange, distorted faces etched into the wood. Around it were offerings, animal bones, wilted flowers, and what looked like blood-stained rags. The air was thick, heavy, and cold despite the warm afternoon. I took a step closer to examine it, and that's when I heard the whisper. At first I thought it was the wind, but the whisper became clearer, a voice murmuring words I couldn't understand. My chest tightened as I realized it was coming from the shrine. I snapped a few photos and hurried back to camp, telling myself it was nothing. But that night, the whispers followed me. As I lay in my tent, I heard them, faint but persistent, weaving through the forest. It felt like they were calling my name. The next day, I showed the photos of the shrine to one of our local guides, an older man named Joe. His face turned pale, and he immediately told me to delete them. "That's a forest keeper's shrine," he said, his voice trembling. "They protect the woods, but they're not kind. You shouldn't have gone near it." I tried to laugh it off, but Joe wasn't joking. "People who mess with the keeper don't last long out here," he added, refusing to say more. That evening, as the sun set, I noticed something strange. On my arm, there was a mark, a jagged, dark line that hadn't been there before. No matter how much I scrubbed, it wouldn't come off. Over the next few days, things got worse. I started seeing things out of the corner of my eye. Shadows darting between the trees, fleeting glimpses of something tall and humanoid. At night, my dreams were plagued by visions of the shrine and the distorted faces carved into it. In the dreams, those faces were alive, their hollow eyes following my every move. One evening, while I was alone near a stream, I heard a branch snap. I turned, and there it was, the Forest Keeper. It was tall, its body covered in moss and bark, its face featureless, except for two glowing eyes. It didn't move, but I could feel its presence pressing down on me like a weight. I ran back to camp as fast as I could. When I told the others, they didn't believe me, except for Joe. He told me I had to make an offering at the shrine to appease the keeper, or it wouldn't stop. That night, armed with nothing but a flashlight and sheer desperation, I returned to the shrine. Joe had given me instructions. Leave something valuable, something that mattered to me. I placed my journal, a notebook filled with my sketches and observations, at the base of the shrine. For a moment, everything was still. Then the whispering returned, louder this time, surrounding me. The air grew icy, and I felt a hand, cold, rough, inhuman, grip my shoulder. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The keeper was there, towering over me. "You are not welcome here," a voice growled, though the keeper's mouth never moved. The grip released and I stumbled back, falling onto the forest floor. The shrine was gone. The keeper was gone. I scrambled to my feet and ran back to camp, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear the rustling leaves behind me. When I reached camp, Joe was waiting. He didn't need to ask what happened. He could see it in my face. "You're lucky," he said. "The keeper let you go, but you need to leave, now." I left the forest the next day, cutting the research trip short. But the mark on my arm never faded, and neither did the nightmares. Sometimes when I'm alone, I hear the whisper again, calling me back to the woods. If you ever find yourself deep in the forests of Maine and see a shrine that doesn't belong, turn around. Leave it alone. The forest keeper doesn't forgive.
The Valley of Screams. I'm Peter, a hunter who spent most of his life exploring the Appalachian Mountains in Kentucky. Hunting has always been my way of connecting with nature and keeping alive the traditions passed down by my grandfather. But last year, during what was supposed to be a routine trip, I encountered something that has made me question everything I thought I knew about these woods. It was early fall, and the air was crisp as I loaded my gear and set out with my dog, Max. Max was my loyal hunting partner, a German Shepherd mix with a nose sharper than any I'd ever seen. We were heading to a remote valley I'd scouted the year before, a place untouched by human hands, or so I thought. The valley was beautiful, surrounded by towering cliffs and dense forests. But as we descended into it, the atmosphere changed. The air felt heavier, and a strange silence blanketed the area. Even Max, usually full of energy, seemed uneasy, his ears perked as if he was hearing something I couldn't. About an hour into the valley, Max stopped suddenly and started growling. Following his gaze, I saw it, a wooden cross, tall and weathered, standing alone in the middle of a clearing. It wasn't like any cross I'd seen before. Its arms were uneven and strange carvings covered its surface. Around its base were bones, animal I hoped, and remnants of burned candles. A chill ran down my spine, but I tried to brush it off as some old marker or an abandoned hunting ritual. Still, Max wouldn't stop growling, his hackles raised as if warning me to turn back. I should have listened to him. As the sun began to set, I set up camp near a stream. Max was restless, pacing around the perimeter of the site. I tried to reassure him, but deep down, I felt the same unease. It was too quiet. No birds, no crickets, just the occasional rustle of leaves. Then I heard it, a scream. It echoed through the valley, high-pitched and gut-wrenching, like the sound of someone in unimaginable pain. Max barked wildly, his ears pinned back. Grabbing my rifle, I scanned the darkness, but there was nothing. The scream came again, this time closer, followed by a low, guttural growl. I barely slept that night. The screams continued sporadically, sometimes close, sometimes distant, as if circling the camp. When dawn finally broke, I decided it was time to leave. But as I packed up, I noticed Max had wandered off. I called for him, but he didn't come back. Following his tracks, I ended up back at the clearing with the cross. This time it was different. Around the cross were fresh signs of activity, circles drawn in the dirt, symbols I didn't recognize, and a strange metallic smell in the air. Then I saw Max. He was lying near the base of the cross, motionless. As I ran to him, I heard voices, low, chanting voices, coming from the forest. Emerging from the trees were figures cloaked in black, their faces obscured by masks. They formed a circle around the cross, ignoring me entirely. Then, one of them raised a hand, and the chanting stopped. The ground beneath the cross began to shake. From its base, a shadowy figure emerged, towering and distorted, its form shifting like smoke. It had no face, only deep, hollow voids where eyes should have been. The chanting resumed, louder now, almost deafening. Max's body twitched, and for a moment I thought he was alive, but then I realized the movement wasn't natural. It was as if the shadow was pulling something from him. A blinding light erupted from the cross, and I stumbled backward, shielding my eyes. When the light faded, Max was gone. The shadowy figure turned its gaze to me, and a voice boomed in my head. "You do not belong here." I ran. I don't remember how I found my way out of the valley, but I ran faster than I ever thought possible. The chanting followed me, echoing in the trees, along with that voice repeating the same phrase, "You do not belong here." When I finally reached my truck, I jumped in and sped away, not looking back. For weeks after, I had nightmares, visions of the shadowy figure, the cloaked men, and Max's lifeless body. I haven't been hunting since. My gear sits untouched in the corner of my garage, and I can't bring myself to go back into the woods. Every so often I hear whispers when I'm alone, faint but unmistakable. The valley is still there, and I'm sure the rituals continue. If you ever find yourself deep in the Appalachian Mountains and hear a scream, don't investigate. Some things aren't meant to be found.
The screams of the cavern. Hi, I'm Bianca, and I've always loved photography. There's something about capturing the world's hidden beauty that gives me a thrill. Over the years, my passion has taken me to remote locations and unusual places. But one trip to Mammoth Cave National Park in Kentucky turned that passion into a nightmare I can't escape. It wasn't supposed to be anything special, just a quick visit to take photos of some lesser-known caves and formations. But deep inside that cavern, I found something that should have stayed buried forever. I arrived early in the morning, armed with my camera and a flashlight. I wanted to avoid the main tourist paths and explore some of the less crowded areas. After checking the map and speaking with a ranger, I veered off toward a lesser-known trail that led to an old, rarely visited cave. The entrance was unassuming, just a dark gap in the side of a rocky hill. But as soon as I stepped inside, I felt it. The air was cold, much colder than it should have been, and heavy, as if something unseen was pressing down on me. The faint drip of water echoed through the cavern, and each step seemed louder than the last. As I moved deeper, the walls began to close in, the space becoming narrower and more claustrophobic. I was snapping pictures of the jagged formations when I heard it for the first time, a faint scream. It wasn't loud, more like a distant wail carried on the wind. I froze, my heart pounding. "It's just the wind," I muttered to myself, though I wasn't sure I believed it. The sound came again, a little louder this time, and unmistakably human. Against my better judgment, I continued forward. The passage opened up into a larger chamber, and that's when I saw them, markings etched into the walls. They weren't natural formations, they were symbols carved with precision. Spirals, jagged lines and shapes that resembled faces or masks stared back at me. In the center of the chamber was a large, flat rock that looked like an altar. Surrounding it were remnants of candles, animal bones, and what appeared to be dried blood. My stomach churned, but I couldn't resist taking a few photos. The markings and altar were unlike anything I'd ever seen. That's when the scream came again, louder and closer, echoing through the chamber. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I thought I saw a shadow dart across the far wall. The scream gave way to a low, guttural moan that seemed to come from all around me. I turned, my flashlight trembling in my hand, and saw them, faces in the darkness. At first, I thought they were just the carvings on the walls, but these moved, shifting and twisting as if alive. Their mouths were open in silent screams, and their hollow eyes seemed to follow me wherever I went. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my camera, and tried to find the passage I'd come through, but it was gone. Or at least, it seemed to be. The walls of the chamber appeared to have shifted, narrowing and closing in, trapping me inside. Then came the whispering. Soft at first, like a breeze brushing past my ear, but growing louder, more insistent. It wasn't one voice, it was many, overlapping and chaotic, speaking a language I didn't understand. The shadows on the walls began to stretch, taking on humanoid forms. I turned and ran, desperate to escape. The chamber seemed to twist and distort, the walls pulsing like a living organism. The shadows followed, their whispers turning into screams. As I ran, the ground beneath me felt unstable, like it was moving. My flashlight flickered again, casting erratic beams of light that made the shadows seem even more alive. At one point, I tripped over a jagged rock and fell, my camera skidding across the ground. Before I could retrieve it, one of the shadows reached it. Its form bent unnaturally, and it picked up the camera. Or at least that's what it looked like. The shadow held it for a moment, before crushing it like it was made of paper. That's when I realized they weren't just following me. They wanted me gone. I don't know how I found the exit. One moment, I was stumbling through the dark, and the next, I was outside, gasping for air under the pale light of the morning sun. I looked back at the cave entrance, half expecting to see the shadows emerge, but there was nothing. The screams had stopped, and the forest was silent. I left everything behind. My camera, my gear, everything. I just wanted to get as far away as possible. When I reported what happened to the park rangers, they dismissed it as a bad case of claustrophobia or overactive imagination. They even joked about cave madness, a phenomenon where prolonged exposure to darkness and silence can play tricks on your mind. But I know what I saw and heard. I've since avoided caves altogether, but the shadows and whispers follow me. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear the screams again, faint but unmistakable. If you ever find yourself exploring a cave and hear something that doesn't belong, turn back. Some places were never meant to be uncovered.
The Vanishing Forest. I'm Jake, a journalist from New York. I specialize in investigative pieces about strange occurrences, unsolved mysteries, and the kinds of stories most people brush off as superstition. When I heard about a string of disappearances in a remote section of Adirondack Park, I knew I had to dig deeper. Locals called it the Vanishing Forest, and though I was skeptical, I couldn't resist the story. What I didn't know was that this would be my last investigation into the unknown. The reports were sparse and inconsistent, but there was a pattern. Hikers, hunters, and campers who ventured into a specific area of the forest never came back. Rangers who searched the area found no evidence, no tracks, no campsites, nothing. It was as if the forest had swallowed them whole. I arrived in the small town bordering the park with my notepad, camera, and recorder. Most locals were reluctant to talk, their faces going pale at the mere mention of the Vanishing Forest. One older man, however, told me something that stuck with me. They're not lost, they're taken. Equipped with a map and supplies, I set out early the next morning. The forest was beautiful, with towering trees and thick undergrowth. For the first few hours, it seemed like any other hike. I stopped frequently to take notes and photos, cataloguing every detail for my article. Around noon, I came across something strange, a clearing in the woods where the trees formed a near-perfect circle. In the center was an old fire pit, surrounded by jagged stones that didn't look natural. They were arranged with care, and each one had symbols carved into its surface, symbols I couldn't recognize. I felt a chill despite the warm autumn air. As I crouched to take a photo, I heard it, a low whisper, barely audible, coming from the trees. I turned, expecting to see another hiker, but there was no one. The whispering grew louder, more distinct, though I still couldn't make out the words. My skin prickled as I scanned the tree line. That's when I saw them, figures moving between the trees. They were barely visible, their forms blending with the shadows, but they were there. I called out, hoping it was just other hikers, but there was no response. Instead, the whispering stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. The figures vanished into the forest, leaving me alone in the clearing. Trying to shake off the unease, I continued deeper into the forest. The trail became harder to follow, the trees denser, the light dimmer. Then I found it. An altar made of stone, similar to the ones in the clearing, but much larger. It was covered in moss and vines, with the same strange symbols etched into it. Around the base of the altar were objects that made my stomach churn. Animal bones, broken glass, and what looked like bits of fabric, some stained red. As I took photos, I felt the air grow colder, and the forest seemed to close in around me. Then came the chanting. The chanting was faint at first, almost like the wind, but it grew louder, more rhythmic. It was coming from somewhere ahead. Against my better judgment, I followed the sound, weaving through the trees until I came to another clearing. What I saw froze me in place. A group of people in dark, hooded robes stood in a circle, chanting in a language I didn't recognize. In the center of the circle was a figure tied to a post, their face obscured. The robed figures swayed as they chanted, their movements unnaturally synchronized. I fumbled with my camera, trying to capture what I was seeing, but as soon as I raised it, one of the robed figures turned and looked directly at me. Though their face was hidden, I felt their gaze pierce through me. The chanting stopped abruptly, and the forest fell into an oppressive silence. The robed figures began moving toward me, their steps slow but deliberate. I turned and ran, adrenaline surging as branches clawed at my arms and legs. The forest seemed alive, the trees twisting and shifting to block my path. The whispering returned, louder now, mingling with faint screams that seemed to come from all directions. I glanced back and saw the figures gliding between the trees impossibly fast. I tripped over a root and fell hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. As I scrambled to my feet, I felt a hand, or something like a hand, graze my shoulder. It was cold and clammy, and it sent a jolt of terror through me. Somehow, I made it back to the main trail. The forest behind me was silent again, but I didn't stop running until I reached my car. My hands were shaking so badly that it took several tries to get the keys into the ignition. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw one of the figures standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. When I returned to town, I tried to tell the authorities what I'd seen. They dismissed me, saying it was likely overactive imagination or exhaustion. But I know what I experienced. The photos I took were corrupted, the images distorted beyond recognition, as if the forest itself didn't want them to exist. I haven't written about the Vanishing Forest. Every time I try, the words won't come. At night, I hear the chanting again, faint but insistent, as if calling me back. If you ever hear about a part of the forest where people go missing, stay away. Some places don't just swallow you, they erase you.
The ritual of the night. Hi, my name is Sarah, and I've always loved solo hiking. There's something about the solitude, the wide open spaces, and the quiet of nature that clears my mind like nothing else. That's why I decided to spend a weekend camping in Joshua Tree National Park, one of the most remote and beautiful places in California. But what I encountered there was far from peaceful. It was something I can't fully explain, something I'll never forget. I arrived at the park early in the day, eager to find a campsite far from the more popular spots. After several hours of hiking, I found it, a secluded clearing surrounded by boulders, with a perfect view of the desert sky. The silence was absolute, and the isolation was exactly what I wanted. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and watched as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. As night fell, I lit a fire, cooked a simple meal, and settled in to enjoy the stars. The desert was alive with sounds, crickets chirping, the occasional rustle of wind through the scrub. It was perfect. Until the firelight revealed something strange. On one of the large boulders near my campsite, there were markings I hadn't noticed before. They looked like carvings, but they weren't random. The lines were intricate, forming symbols and shapes that seemed almost deliberate. I ran my fingers over them, feeling the grooves etched into the stone. I shrugged it off, thinking it must have been the work of some bored hikers, or maybe ancient petroglyphs. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Around midnight, as I was lying outside my tent staring at the stars, I saw it. A flicker of orange light in the distance. A bonfire. It was faint, far away, but unmistakable. At first I felt relieved. I wasn't completely alone out here after all. But then I noticed the sound. It wasn't the crackling of a fire or the murmur of voices. It was chanting. Low, rhythmic, and growing louder, even though the fire was still far away. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unsettling, almost like a prayer or a warning. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate. Grabbing my flashlight, I made my way toward the light. The desert at night is disorienting, and the bonfire seemed both closer and farther away with every step. Finally, I crested a ridge and froze. Below me was a group of people, maybe a dozen, standing in a circle around the fire. They wore dark, hooded robes, their faces obscured. In the center of the circle was a large figure, taller than any human I'd ever seen. Its body was twisted, almost skeletal, and it cast a shadow that didn't match the fire's light. I knelt behind a rock, my heart pounding. The chanting grew louder, and the fire seemed to burn brighter, its flames turning an unnatural shade of green. The figure in the center began to move, its limbs jerking as if it were a puppet on strings. I must have made a sound, a loose rock shifting under my weight, or maybe just the sound of my breathing, because suddenly the chanting stopped. The hooded figures turned as one, their faces hidden in the darkness, and stared directly at me. Panic surged through me as I scrambled back, but it was too late. The tall figure in the center of the fire turned its head toward me. Even from a distance, I could feel its gaze, a suffocating pressure that seemed to freeze me in place. It raised one long, spindly arm and pointed at me. I ran. My flashlight flickered as I stumbled through the rocky terrain, my footsteps echoing in the stillness of the desert. Behind me, I could hear them, the hooded figures, their feet crunching against the sand and stone. Worse, I could hear the thing they had summoned. Its movements were unnatural, like the crackling of dry branches, and its guttural growls sent shivers down my spine. I glanced back once and immediately regretted it. The tall figure was gaining on me, its limbs impossibly long, and its face a featureless void. The hooded figures followed in silence, their robes billowing in a wind I couldn't feel. Just as I thought I couldn't run any farther, I stumbled into another clearing. This one was smaller, with a circle of stones at its center. The air here felt different, charged, almost electric. Desperate, I stepped inside the circle, hoping it would shield me somehow. To my astonishment, the hooded figures stopped at the edge of the clearing. The tall figure let out a deafening scream, a sound that seemed to shake the ground beneath me. It stepped forward but couldn't cross the circle. For a moment, I thought I was safe. The tall figure raised both its arms, and the hooded figures began chanting again. The stones around me glowed faintly, and I felt an overwhelming urge to leave the circle. It was as if the air itself was trying to push me out. But I stayed put, clutching the flashlight like it was a weapon. The tall figure leaned forward, its empty face inches from mine, and spoke. Its voice was deep and raspy, like the sound of wind through dead trees. "You were not invited." The chanting stopped, and the figure recoiled, as if some unseen force was pulling it back. The fire in the distance extinguished instantly, plunging the desert into darkness. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. As soon as the pressure lifted, I bolted back the way I came, navigating by memory and the faint glow of my flashlight. When I finally reached my campsite, I grabbed my gear and ran all the way to my car. I didn't stop until I was miles away from the park. I haven't gone hiking since. The desert, once my sanctuary, now feels like a trap. At night, I sometimes wake up to the faint sound of chanting, and I'm terrified that one day I'll see the firelight again. If you ever visit Joshua Tree and see a bonfire in the distance, don't go near it. Some rituals aren't meant to be interrupted.
The Red Lake. My name is Matt, and I'm a fisherman. I've spent most of my life on the water, casting lines and enjoying the peace that comes with it. There's something calming about the gentle ripples and the sound of birds overhead. But one trip to a remote lake in northern Minnesota turned that calm into pure terror, a nightmare I can't escape. It started as a normal fishing trip. I'd heard rumors of a secluded lake deep in the wilderness, supposedly untouched by anglers. A hidden gem, some locals called it, but others avoided the topic, their faces turning uneasy when I asked about the lake's location. That only made me more curious. After hours of hiking through dense forest, I finally found it. The lake was beautiful at first glance, its surface perfectly still, reflecting the surrounding trees like a mirror. But as I got closer, I noticed something strange. The water wasn't clear or blue. It was a deep, murky red, like rusted iron or old blood. Must be some kind of algae or minerals, I thought, trying to brush off the unease creeping up my spine. I set up my gear on the shore and cast my line. The first hour was uneventful, not a single bite. I noticed the usual signs of life. Fish breaking the surface, the sound of frogs, were absent. The lake felt dead. Then I heard it. A faint splash, far out in the center of the lake. It wasn't the sound of a fish jumping or a bird diving. It was heavier, like something large breaking the water's surface. I stared, squinting against the glare of the sun, but saw nothing. Minutes later, I felt a tug on my line. Excitement replaced my unease as I reeled in quickly, expecting a big catch. But when I pulled the line out of the water, there was nothing on the hook. Nothing except a piece of cloth, red, soaked and frayed, as if it had been in the water for years. As the afternoon wore on, I noticed strange objects scattered along the shoreline. Bones, small and large, some animal and some I couldn't identify. Rusted cans, broken jars, and scraps of clothing. They looked like offerings, carefully arranged in small piles near the edge of the water. The air grew colder, and the once still surface of the lake began to ripple, though there was no wind. That's when I noticed the carvings on the rocks around the shore, symbols etched into the stone, similar to the ones I'd seen in books about ancient rituals. I started to pack up my gear, feeling the urge to leave, but something stopped me. The sound of a voice, faint but clear, calling my name, Matt. It was soft, like a whisper carried on the wind, but unmistakable. I scanned the lake, trying to find the source of the voice, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing waist-deep in the water, far out in the center of the lake. Its body was dark, almost featureless, blending with the red water. I couldn't see a face, but I felt its gaze lock onto me. The figure raised an arm pointing toward me, and the whisper came again, louder this time. Matt, come. Panic surged through me, but my legs felt rooted to the ground. The figure began to move, gliding across the surface of the water without disturbing it. The ripples grew stronger, radiating outward like the lake itself was alive. Before I knew what was happening, I felt a force pulling me toward the lake. My feet slid across the damp ground as if invisible hands were dragging me closer. I grabbed at the rocks and roots, struggling against the pull, but it was relentless. The figure was closer now, its form more defined. It wasn't human. Its limbs were too long, its movements too unnatural. The whispering turned into a chorus, overlapping voices calling my name, demanding that I enter the water. As I reached the edge of the lake, the cold seeped into my body, and I realized the red water wasn't just murky. It was thick, almost viscous, like blood. Just as I felt my foot touch the water, I heard a sharp bark behind me. Turning, I saw a dog, a stray that must have followed my trail. It barked again, snapping me out of my trance. I scrambled back, the pull lessening as the dog continued to bark furiously. The figure stopped, its outstretched arm retracting slowly. The water's surface calmed, and the voices faded, replaced by an oppressive silence. I grabbed my gear and ran, the dog following close behind. When I reached the safety of the forest, I looked back at the lake one last time. The figure was gone, but the red water seemed to shimmer, as if waiting for me to return. I made my way back to town, shaken but alive. I tried to tell the locals what had happened, but they refused to listen. "You're lucky to be here," one old man said, his tone grave. "Most who find that lake don't come back." I've never fished again. The water, once my solace, now feels like a threat. At night, I still hear the whispers, faint but persistent, calling me back to the Red Lake. If you ever hear about a lake deep in the woods with water the color of blood, stay away. Some places aren't meant to be disturbed.
The Black Tree. My name is Clara, and I'm a historian. My work usually involves studying ancient cultures and artifacts, but every once in a while I get drawn into local legends and myths. One of these legends brought me to a small town in Vermont, where I discovered something that still haunts me, the Black Tree. Locals said the tree was cursed, a place where old rituals had been performed for centuries. Some said it was a gateway to another world. Others claimed it consumed the souls of those who came too close. I didn't believe any of it, until I saw it for myself. I arrived in the town of Hartwell on a chilly October afternoon. The trees were ablaze with fall colours, but the locals seemed less interested in the beauty of the season and more concerned about my reason for visiting. "You don't want to go near that tree," warned one woman at the diner, where I stopped for coffee. "People don't come back the same." Despite their warnings, I made my way to the edge of town, following an old dirt road that led into the forest. After about an hour of walking, I found it. The Black Tree. It stood alone in a small clearing, its trunk charred and blackened as if it had been struck by lightning, yet it was alive. The branches were twisted and gnarled, stretching out like skeletal fingers. Around its base were carvings, symbols etched deeply into the bark, some weathered with age, others fresh. The air around the tree felt different, thicker, colder. I took out my camera and began documenting everything. As I circled the tree, I noticed objects scattered around its roots. Bones, some small and clearly animal, others harder to identify. Rusted tools, broken bottles, and scraps of cloth, all arranged deliberately, like offerings. Among them was something that made my stomach turn. A doll, hand-sewn, with pins stuck into its body and its eyes missing. I knelt down to take a closer look when I felt it. A presence, not someone standing behind me, but the tree itself. It felt like it was watching, like it was alive and aware of me. The wind picked up, carrying with it a faint whisper I couldn't quite make out. Determined to understand the truth behind the legend, I spent the rest of the day researching the symbols and markings I'd found on the tree. Back at my hotel, I compared them to notes I'd brought on old New England folklore. What I found was disturbing. The symbols were associated with protection and binding, often used in rituals to trap malevolent spirits or gods. According to the legend, the Black Tree was a prison holding something ancient and dangerous. The offerings were meant to keep it contained, but what terrified me most was the last part of the story. If the offerings stopped or were disturbed, the tree would awaken, and whatever was inside would be released. That night, I couldn't sleep. The air in my room felt heavy, oppressive, and the whispering I'd heard earlier seemed to echo in my ears. Against my better judgment, I decided to return to the tree, convinced I was missing something. When I reached the clearing, the atmosphere was completely different. The tree seemed larger, its branches swaying even though there was no wind. The offerings around its base had been disturbed, bones scattered, objects moved. In the center of it all was something new, a small pile of ash, still smoking. As I stepped closer, The whispering grew louder, clearer. It wasn't in English. It wasn't in any language I recognized. The tree's bark began to shift, the carvings glowing faintly, and the ground beneath me trembled. Before I could move, I saw it. Emerging from the trunk of the tree was a figure, tall and humanoid but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its body made of shadow and smoke. Its face, or what should have been its face, was a void, an absence that seemed to suck in all the light around it. The whispers became deafening, and I realized they weren't coming from the tree. They were coming from the thing inside it. The entity raised an arm, and the ground around the tree cracked and split, releasing a foul, sulfuric smell. "You disturbed the balance," it said, though its mouth didn't move. The voice echoed inside my head, cold and emotionless. "You should not have come." I turned and ran, the forest twisting and warping around me, as if the trees themselves were trying to trap me. The whispers followed, growing louder, mixing with guttural growls and the sound of branches snapping. When I finally broke through the edge of the forest, I collapsed on the ground, gasping for air. The whispers stopped, and when I looked back, the forest was still. The black tree was hidden somewhere within, but I could feel its presence, like a dark stain on the landscape. I left Hartwell the next morning, refusing to stay another night. But the experience hasn't left me. At night, I dream of the tree, its branches reaching out, the shadowy figure waiting inside. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I hear the whispers again. I've stopped researching legends and folklore. Some stories are better left untold, some mysteries better left unsolved. If you ever hear about a cursed tree in a small town, do yourself a favor, stay far away. Not all prisons are made of stone and steel.
The Forbidden Clearing. My name is Andrew, and I'm an avid camper. I've spent countless weekends exploring national parks, hiking remote trails, and sleeping under the stars. For me, there's no greater escape from the chaos of everyday life. But my last trip to Shenandoah National Park in Virginia made me question everything I thought I knew about the wilderness. That trip introduced me to the Forbidden Clearing, a place I wish I'd never found. It started as a spontaneous weekend adventure. I had a free weekend and decided to explore a less popular section of the park. Armed with a map, my camping gear, and a sense of adventure, I set off early Saturday morning. The trail was peaceful, winding through dense forests and offering stunning views of the mountains. About 5 miles in, I noticed a faint side path branching off from the main trail. It wasn't marked on my map, but curiosity got the better of me. The path led downhill, deeper into the forest, and after about a half mile, I found it. A clearing surrounded by towering pines. In the center of the clearing was something unusual, a totem. It stood about 6 feet tall, made of weathered wood, and adorned with carvings. Symbols, faces, and jagged lines covered its surface, and at its base were small piles of stones and bones. It looked ancient, out of place, almost ceremonial. I set up camp at the edge of the clearing, thinking it was the perfect spot, secluded and undisturbed. The air felt cooler here, and the only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves and the chirping of crickets. As night fell, the atmosphere shifted. The crickets stopped chirping, and an unnatural silence descended. I tried to brush it off, but then I heard it. A faint whisper carried on the wind. I froze, straining to listen. It wasn't the wind. It was voices. The sound seemed to come from the totem. Grabbing my flashlight, I cautiously approached it. The carvings on its surface seemed to shift in the flickering light, the faces almost alive. The whispers grew louder, forming words I couldn't understand. My chest tightened, and I backed away, stumbling over a root. I tried to sleep, but the whispers wouldn't stop. They were faint, distant, but persistent. Around midnight, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside, shining my flashlight toward the totem. That's when I saw them. Figures stood at the edge of the clearing, their shapes barely visible in the darkness. They were tall, human-like, but their proportions were wrong. Limbs too long, heads tilted unnaturally. Their eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the light like an animal's in the dark. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching. Panicked, I retreated to my tent, clutching my flashlight like it was a weapon. The figures stayed where they were, unmoving, but the whispers intensified. They weren't just in the air anymore, they were in my head, an endless chant that made it impossible to think. Then the ground beneath the totem began to tremble. A low, guttural hum resonated through the clearing, and the figures stepped forward, forming a circle around the totem. Their movements were stiff, puppet-like, as if they weren't entirely in control of their bodies. The totem began to glow faintly, its carvings radiating an eerie green light. The whispering turned into chanting, rhythmic and haunting, as the figures raised their arms toward the sky. From the base of the totem, a shadow began to rise. At first, it was just a dark mist, but it grew, taking form. It was massive, towering over the clearing, its shape constantly shifting. It had no eyes, no mouth, just an endless void where its face should have been. The chanting grew louder, and the shadow turned toward me. Even without a face, I knew it was looking at me. I felt its gaze like a weight pressing down on my chest, freezing me in place. "You do not belong here," it said, though its voice wasn't spoken. It echoed inside my head, deep and resonant, filling me with a terror I'd never known. I don't know how I found the strength to move, but I ran. Grabbing my bag, I sprinted toward the path, not caring where it led as long as it was away from the clearing. Behind me, I heard the figures moving, their footsteps unnatural and staggered. The shadow moved with them, gliding silently through the trees. The forest seemed to close in on me, the branches clawing at my arms and face. The whispers followed, louder now, mingling with guttural growls and distorted screams. Every time I glanced back, the shadow was closer, its presence sucking the light from the air. I burst out of the forest onto the main trail, gasping for breath. The whispering stopped, and the shadow and figures were gone, as if they had never been there. But the clearing still felt close, as if it were watching me even now. I ran all the way back to my car, my legs trembling and my mind racing. When I finally reached it, I sat behind the wheel, staring back at the trailhead, half expecting the figures to emerge from the trees. They didn't. I reported the clearing to the park rangers, but they didn't believe me. They said there was no record of a totem or any unusual activity in that part of the park. One even laughed and suggested I'd been dreaming. But I know what I saw. I haven't been camping since. The wilderness, once my refuge, now feels like a trap. At night, I still hear the whispers, faint and distant, calling me back. If you ever come across a clearing with a totem in the center, don't stay. Don't camp. Just leave. Some places aren't meant to be discovered.
The cabin by the river. My name is Lily, and I'm 11 years old. This happened last summer when I went to visit my grandparents at their farm in the Midwest. My parents were busy with work, so they sent me to spend the summer there. I always loved their farm, the big fields, the barn with the animals, and the peaceful sound of the river nearby. But something happened that summer. Something I can't stop thinking about. It all started with the cabin by the river. The warning Grandma and Grandpa were always telling me to stay away from the river. "The current's too strong," Grandpa would say, "and there's things down there that don't belong to us." I didn't understand what he meant by that last part, but I promised to stay close to the house. Still, from the kitchen window, I could see the river winding through the trees. It looked so calm, so inviting. I couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to go down there. One afternoon, I finally worked up the courage to ask Grandpa about the cabin I'd heard him mention to Grandma. "What's the cabin by the river?" I asked. His face went pale, and for a moment, he didn't say anything. "That cabin's been abandoned for years," he said finally. "Don't you go near it, understand?" I nodded, but his reaction only made me more curious. The first visit. A few days later, I decided to sneak down to the river. It was late in the afternoon, and I told Grandma I was going to play with the chickens. Instead, I slipped through the trees toward the water. The river was beautiful, sparkling in the sunlight. I followed the bank until I saw it. The cabin. It was small, with wooden walls that were dark and weathered. The roof was partially caved in, and vines crept up the sides. As I got closer, I noticed strange symbols carved into the door and walls. Spirals, jagged lines, and shapes that looked like faces. The air around the cabin felt heavy, almost like it was pressing down on me. But I couldn't stop myself. I pushed open the door, and it creaked loudly, echoing in the quiet. Inside, the cabin was dark and smelled like damp wood. Hanging from the ceiling were dolls made of sticks and twine, swinging slightly even though there was no wind. On the floor were more symbols, drawn in a reddish-brown color that made my stomach turn. I didn't stay long. Something about the place felt wrong, like it was watching me. I ran back to the house, my heart pounding, and decided not to tell anyone. The whispers. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the cabin and the strange symbols. I wanted to forget about it, but I couldn't. As I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I started to hear something. Whispers. They were faint, coming from outside, but they sounded like my name. Lily! Lily! I sat up, my heart racing. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. I peeked out the window, but all I saw was darkness. The next morning, I asked Grandpa about the cabin again. Has anyone ever lived there? I asked. He sighed, looking out the window toward the river. Long time ago, he said, but they didn't stay. The river doesn't like people getting too close. The lure of the river. The whispers continued over the next few nights, always coming from the direction of the river. They sounded like my own voice, calling to me, begging me to come back. I tried to ignore them, but it was like they were in my head, pulling me toward the cabin. One afternoon, I couldn't resist anymore. I told myself I'd just take another look, just to see if I'd imagined everything. When I reached the cabin, the door was already open. Inside, the stick dolls were gone, replaced by something else. A single, larger doll sitting in the middle of the floor. It was crudely made, with a head of knotted twine and arms that were too long. As I stepped closer, the whispers returned, louder now. Lily, Lily, and come to the water. I turned and ran, not stopping until I reached the safety of the house. But that night, the whispers were even louder, and this time, they weren't just outside, they were in my room. The river's grip. The next day, Grandpa noticed I was acting strange. You went down there, didn't you? He asked, his voice stern. I nodded, tears in my eyes. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. You've got to stay away from that place, he interrupted. The river doesn't let go of what it takes. That night, the whispers turned into something worse. I woke up to the sound of rushing water, even though the river was far from the house. When I looked out the window, I saw something that made my blood run cold, a figure standing at the edge of the yard. It was tall and thin with long, stick-like arms. Its face was blank, but it tilted its head as if it could see me. Then it raised one hand and pointed toward the river. The rescue. I don't remember getting out of bed, but the next thing I knew I was outside walking toward the river. The figure was ahead of me, leading the way. The whispers were deafening now, and I felt like I was in a trance, unable to stop myself. Just as I reached the edge of the water, I heard another voice, Grandpa's. He was running toward me, shouting my name. The figure turned, its blank face glaring at him, and the whispers stopped. Grandpa grabbed me and pulled me back, yelling something I couldn't understand. The figure vanished, and the air grew still. The aftermath. The next morning, Grandpa boarded up the path to the river and warned me never to go near it again. He didn't explain what had happened, but I didn't need him to. I could feel it. The river wanted me, and the cabin was its lure. I haven't been back to the farm since. At night, I still hear the whispers sometimes, faint but unmistakable, calling me back to the water. If you ever hear about a cabin near a river, stay away. Some places aren't meant to be found.
The Condemned Hotel. Hi, my name is Julia, and I'm a freelance photographer. My job often takes me to unusual places, and I love staying in old hotels, soaking in their charm and history. But during a trip to New Orleans, I stayed in a hotel that made me question everything I thought I knew about the past, and left me with scars I'll never forget. The Lafayette Grand was a beautiful old building in the heart of the city, with high ceilings, ornate chandeliers, and an air of faded grandeur. The receptionist, an older woman with a thick Louisiana accent, handed me my room key and said something I didn't quite catch. "What was that?" I asked, distracted by the charm of the lobby. "Oh, nothing important," she replied quickly. "Just stay on your floor, sweetie. The upper floors are under renovation." That struck me as odd, but I shrugged it off. The hotel was old, after all. Renovations made sense. My room was on the 3rd floor, a cozy suite with a window overlooking the street below. After unpacking, I grabbed my camera and went out to explore the city. When I returned later that evening, the lobby was quiet, almost eerily so. As I waited for the elevator, I noticed a small sign taped to the wall. Floors 4 and 5 closed, staff only. It was handwritten, as if hastily made, and for some reason, it gave me a weird feeling. The elevator dinged, and I stepped inside. As I hit the button for the 3rd floor, my curiosity got the better of me. I reached out and pressed the button for the 4th floor. The elevator jolted slightly as it ascended, and the doors opened to reveal a dark, silent hallway. The lights overhead flickered, casting long, uneven shadows on the faded wallpaper. I stepped out cautiously, my camera slung around my neck. The hallway felt wrong, colder than it should have been, and with a faint smell of mildew and something metallic. The doors along the corridor were all closed, their brass numbers tarnished and unreadable. As I walked, I noticed faint scratches on some of the doors, like someone had tried to claw their way out. Then I heard it. A faint sound, like footsteps, coming from farther down the hall. The footsteps grew louder, and I froze. "Hello?" I called, my voice echoing unnaturally. There was no response, but the sound didn't stop. Instead, it grew faster, almost frantic, until it was directly behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there, just the empty hallway. My heart pounded as I backed toward the elevator, snapping a few pictures as I went. When I finally reached the elevator and hit the button, it felt like an eternity before the doors opened. As they slid shut, I thought I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A figure standing at the end of the hall, watching me. Back in my room, I tried to shake off the experience, convincing myself it was just my imagination. But when I looked at the photos I'd taken, my blood ran cold. In one of the pictures, there was a shadowy figure standing in the middle of the hallway. Its form was blurry, indistinct, but its head was tilted unnaturally, as if staring directly at the camera. In another photo, the scratches on the doors appeared to glow faintly, forming symbols I hadn't noticed before. I tried to delete the photos, but my camera froze, the screen flickering. Then, for a brief moment, I saw the shadowy figure again. Not in the hallway, but on the screen itself. It seemed to be reaching toward me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing faint whispers, like voices carried on a breeze, though my window was closed. Around 2 a.m., I decided to investigate the 4th floor again, hoping to make sense of what I'd seen. This time, I took the stairs, my flashlight in hand. The hallway was just as dark and foreboding as before, but now the whispers were louder, more insistent. They seemed to be coming from one of the rooms near the end of the hall. The door to room 407 was slightly ajar, the faint smell of iron wafting from inside. I pushed it open and nearly screamed. The room was bare except for an old, crumbling altar in the centre. Symbols were scrawled on the walls in a dark, dried substance, and candles were arranged in a circle around the altar. On the floor was a pile of bones, small, human-like, and arranged in a grotesque pattern. As I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me. The air grew icy, and the whispers turned into guttural growls. Shadows began to move along the walls, converging on the altar. They were humanoid but distorted, their limbs too long, their faces blank. One by one they turned toward me. "You shouldn't have come," a voice growled, though no one spoke. I backed away, my flashlight flickering. The shadows began to crawl toward me, their movements jerky and unnatural. I screamed, banging on the door, but it wouldn't budge. Just as one of the shadows reached out, its hand inches from my face, the door flew open. The receptionist stood there, her face pale. "Get out!" she shouted. She pulled me down the stairs and out of the building. "You weren't supposed to go up there," she said, her voice trembling. "That floor's been closed for decades. Too many accidents." When I tried to ask her more, she shook her head. "Just leave and don't come back." I didn't need to be told twice. I packed my things and drove home that night, but the experience hasn't left me. The photos from that night are still on my camera, but I can't bring myself to look at them again. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I hear the whispers, the same ones from the hotel. And at night, in the corners of my room, I see the shadows watching. If you ever stay in an old hotel and hear about a floor that's closed, don't investigate. Some places are better left undisturbed.
The Stone Circle. Hi, my name is Rick, and I've always loved camping with my friends. There's something about sitting around a fire, sharing stories, and sleeping under the stars that makes me feel alive. Last summer, we planned what we thought would be the ultimate trip, a remote campsite deep in the Rockies, away from everyone and everything. We didn't realize the place we chose wasn't just remote, it was cursed. There were 5 of us on the trip. Me, my girlfriend Lisa, and our friends Josh, Amanda, and Kevin. The hike to the campsite took hours, winding through dense forests and steep trails. But when we arrived, it was worth it. The clearing was surrounded by tall pines, with a perfect view of the mountains in the distance. But in the center of the clearing was something strange, a circle of stones. They were large, about knee-high, and arranged in a perfect ring. At first, we thought they were just rocks someone had placed there as a fire pit, but they didn't look natural. Each stone was covered in strange carvings, symbols and shapes none of us recognized. "This is pretty creepy," Amanda said, poking at one of the stones with a stick. "Maybe it's some kind of old ritual site. Or maybe it's just rocks," Josh said, laughing. But his laugh sounded nervous. That evening, we built our fire outside the circle, deciding it was best not to mess with it. As the night went on, we talked, laughed, and told ghost stories, the kind of harmless fun we'd had on every camping trip. But as the fire burned lower, the atmosphere changed. The forest, so alive with the sounds of insects and rustling leaves earlier, grew silent. The air felt heavy, and the shadows cast by the fire seemed to stretch farther than they should. Lisa was the first to notice. "Do you guys hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. We all fell silent, straining to listen. At first there was nothing. Then we heard it, a low hum, rhythmic and almost musical, coming from the direction of the stone circle. Josh, always the fearless one, grabbed his flashlight and headed toward the circle. "Come on, it's probably just the wind," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. The rest of us followed, staying close together. As we approached the stones, the hum grew louder, turning into whispers. It wasn't one voice, but many, overlapping and incomprehensible. The carvings on the stones seemed to shimmer in the flashlight's beam, almost as if they were moving. "That's not normal," Amanda said, her voice shaking. Then, out of nowhere, Kevin screamed. We turned to see him clutching his arm, his face pale. "Something touched me," he said, backing away from the circle. "There's no one here," I said. But even as I said it, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. We decided to call it a night, but none of us could sleep. The whispers continued, faint but persistent, like they were just outside our tents. Around 3 a.m., I heard footsteps outside. At first, I thought it was one of my friends, but when I unzipped my tent, I saw them, shadows. They weren't cast by the fire or the moonlight. They moved on their own, darting between the trees and circling the stone ring. I froze, unable to look away, as one of the shadows stopped and turned toward me. It had no face, just a void where its features should have been. By dawn, we were all on edge. Kevin's arm was bruised where he'd felt the touch, and the whispers hadn't stopped. "We need to leave," Lisa said, and everyone agreed. But as we packed up, we noticed something horrifying. The stones had moved. The circle, once in the center of the clearing, was now closer, just a few feet from where we'd set up our tents. And in the middle of the circle was something new, a small pile of ash, still smoldering. "We didn't light anything in there," Amanda whispered. "How did that happen?" Before we could figure it out, the humming started again, louder this time. The ground beneath the stones began to shake, and the ash pile erupted into flames. From the flames emerged a figure, tall and humanoid but twisted, its limbs too long and its body shifting like smoke. Its presence was suffocating, and the whispers became screams filling the air. "You don't belong here," it said, though its mouth didn't move. Its voice was deep, resonating in my chest like a drumbeat. Josh grabbed my arm. "We have to go, now!" We ran, the shadowy figure following, its movements impossibly fast. The trees seemed to close in, the trail disappearing as the forest became a maze. The whispers grew louder, turning into laughter, mocking, taunting. Somehow, we burst out of the forest onto the trailhead where we'd started the hike. The air felt lighter, and the whispers stopped. When I looked back, the forest was still, as if nothing had happened, but something had followed us. Later that night back at home, I found scratches on my arm, symbols like the ones carved into the stones. Josh said he heard the whispers in his dreams, and Amanda swore she saw shadows moving in her house. We haven't spoken much about what happened that weekend. None of us have been camping since. The stone circle is still out there waiting for the next group of curious hikers to stumble upon it. If you ever find a clearing with a ring of stones, don't stay. Don't touch them. Just leave. Some places are not meant to be discovered.